though Wild Seed is technically book 1, it wasn't the first, or the second, or I think even the third book written in this series. But I should not have worried, because this book is definitely designed to be an entry point. When I was reading it, it felt a lot like a really good TV show pilot. The first episode, it sets up the world, it sets up the characters, you can see that these characters are going to have so many more complicated adventures, and yet, it doesn't feel like an extraneous sequel. It feels like an integral part in setting up the story, which makes me really wonder how it would feel to read this series in actual publication order, where everything is just kind of a prequel to a previous thing. And yet it is designed as one continuous story that builds on itself. Now, I also read this book as part of my challenge to read what the Likewise app suggested to me. So go check out that video where I talk all about Likewise, because I have some more thoughts there. Okay, first I want to talk about the reason why I haven't picked up an Octavia E Butler book before this, because I heard that they were good, but whenever I looked at the covers, they weren't so good, and Wild Seed has had its own history of good and bad covers. And perhaps this is just us judging it out of time, that maybe these were great covers back in the 80s, but also that does not capture the majesty and wonderfulness of this book. And I was also pondering as I read this book, like, how is this book science fiction? Because it really feels like it's more in the historical, fantasy, magical realism kind of camps, but it's more marketed, promoted as science fiction. And maybe that's just that the genre labels of science fiction and fantasy and stuff have shifted. That once upon a time when this came out in 1980, this was science fiction, and it does have some sciencey elements to it. Like, Anyanwu's powers are very linked with DNA manipulation. And there's also, like, strong themes of eugenics and stuff. Or maybe it's just that the other books in the series are more modern-y and are more actual sci-fi, and then this just gets lumped in with all those because it's in the same series. But either way, if you are a lover of sci-fi or fantasy, this might be the book for you. And I would like to do a deep dive into the two main characters, Anyanwu and Doro, because they deserve some analysis here. Let's start with Doro, because I think I have more to say about Anyanwu, and we can just build up to that, you know? It'll be like our finale here. So, Doro is evil, and kind of crazy, and super manipulative, and overall a very bad guy. But he is also one of the protagonists and point of view characters of this story. He's also kind of the antagonist, but it's all mixed up in there. He's been alive for thousands of years, and he has lost touch with pretty much any semblance of having a good moral code, and he is kidnapping people and moving them into his little cult towns, and then grooming them and raising them, and then having sex with probably everybody, but especially all the women. Yeah, so he's a messed up psycho, but also it was pretty fun to read from his perspective. And part of that is that I imagined more sympathy for him than he probably actually deserved. Because he's been alive for so long. He must be so lonely. Or at least maybe he was, and he's just come so far from normal human baseline that he doesn't even, know what lonely is anymore. And that's the crux with Doro and with these towns that he's creating. They're breeding programs because he's trying to breed different mutants and people with unusual abilities until he can produce someone who is immortal like himself. And it's just like a weird hobby for him, he's just trying to improve humanity. And also, he wants a buddy. He wants someone else with him who is immortal. So then when he stumbles across Anyanwu, who is immortal, of course he doesn't appreciate her. And this is like the capsule of Doro's major weakness. He's got a lot of messed up, twisted things about him, but his main weakness is that he's so old, and he's been going around in circles for so long, he's lost sight of his own goals. At some point, he's not being motivated really by anything bigger than just continuing this breeding program that he started, or having the momentary pleasure he gets out of stealing the bodies of the mutant people he's cultivated. But then we have Anyanwu, who is also an immortal, but only about 300 years old. Oh, Anyanwu. I have so many things to say about her. So the thing about Anyanwu is she is set up, at least in part, as the foil to Doro. As Doro is out of control and doing all these crazy things, and someone needs to stop Doro. Someone needs to convince him to stop, because who can really stop Doro if you're a body-snatching spirit who's been alive for thousands of years? And enter Anyanwu, someone who is too valuable for Doro to kill. Too valuable as a breeder for his breeding program. You know how it is. And then when Isaac tells Anyanwu, you have the power to change Doro. Because you're going to be around for a really long time. That's really what he needs, is someone who can understand him and be with him for longer than a lifetime. And the narrative really agrees with Isaac there, that it positions Anyanwu as this fairly indestructible, superpower, awesome, strong woman, that she'll be able to challenge Doro and get away with it and fix all of this craziness that he's stirring up in the world. But then does she? No. And that was pretty disappointing, that I kept waiting for this Doro v Anyanwu confrontation, and it was gonna be so epic. And she does occasionally argue with him, but then she's the one who always backs down because he always has the trump card of, I know where all your children are, I'll go do things to them. And Anyanwu, caring about her children, backs down. And when does Anyanwu finally not back down and make Doro instead back down? Well, of course, it's the end of the book when she loses the will to live, and then Doro is like, but I can't live without you. And she's like, I'm committing suicide tomorrow unless you change your ways. And so he does, a little bit. Or at least he tells her he will. We know how far Doro's promises can be trusted. Which is frustrating. I was promised Anyanwu, girl power, awesome, independent, caring. And then, what is she in the end? Her power comes from her depression and suicidal tendencies? So I didn't like that part. It sends a weird message, and I feel like the opposite of the message that the book was really trying to do. Because in the end, Anyanwu only had power over Doro when she had given up. Which wasn't really her power over Doro, it was Doro giving in to the fact that he realizes finally that he can't live without Anyanwu. Because she's the only one that will really be able to keep him company and give any sense of consistency to his life. But now let's switch gears a little bit and look really at how Anyanwu and Doro influence each other, but especially how Doro rubs off on Anyanwu. Anyanwu in these books is like the matriarchal power, and Doro is the patriarchal power. They're both in these books pretty gender fluid, and yet those are still the roles that they perform in the narrative. That Anyanwu is power in the way that is motherly and caring, and Doro is the power in the way that is toxic masculinity, manipulative, lying, etc. And this book really plays with those two ideas a lot, and it's pretty interesting. Because at the beginning of the narrative, Anyanwu is the old wise woman living in the woods. And she does have connections to her various descendants that live in villages nearby, but it's not like she's the ruler there. She has power, but she also is under the guise of this wise old woman because she doesn't want to appear threatening. She doesn't want to be the leader because she knows that there can be danger that comes from being a super powerful figure that people are afraid of. Then comes in Doro, the super powerful figure that everyone's afraid of. And I think Anyanwu seeing how well he makes it work makes her want to make it work with herself. Because she goes and lives in his cult colony for a few generations, and she sees that because everyone in this colony has kind of grown up with Doro's weirdness and ultimate power, they're just all totally fine with it. Yes, there are rebels, but Doro takes care of them, and it's all fine. And in general, people in the town are happy. So then Anyanwu runs away, and what does she do? Does she become another old wise woman living in the woods, kind of secluded someplace? No! She takes power into her own hands and creates her own colony of misfits and mutants. And the way she goes about it is a little bit different than Doro. Doro just kind of like, oh, you've got good mutant potential, kidnap, coerce. But for Anyanwu, her goal is to give these weirdos, these mutants, these people with various psychic abilities, a home. But she's also collecting the mutants because she's seen from Doro that these are the people that are going to accept her. And what was Anyanwu really thinking here? She had to realize that one day Doro would find her little colony that she's assembled and say to himself, the perfect collection of mutants. Thank you. These are now in my breeding program. And because Anyanwu still to this point hasn't stood up to him at all, there's like nothing she can do. She even warns the people. She's like, don't even try to rebel if Doro comes knocking. It'll just turn out bad. So in the end, she's just kind of collecting these people for his breeding program. Yes, she's doing it much nicer, much kinder than he is, but that is the end result, and realistically, she knew that. But the most interesting part of this book to me is when Doro comes knocking, he's staying with Anyanwu's community for a little bit, he's threatening to make them into his breeding program, and then Anyanwu is talking to one of her children, one of the people at the colony, and the little girl is like, are you gonna make Doro go away? And Anyanwu is like, I'll talk to him. I'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. And then the little girl is like, doubting her word, like, can you really take care of it? And then Anyanwu is threatened, offended that this child would doubt her ability. That this child had grown up in Anyanwu's community, where Anyanwu's word had always been law, had always been good enough, and now Doro comes in and suddenly her word isn't law, isn't good enough? Which is such a Doro thing to think. Anyanwu hasn't set herself up as the benevolent community healer. She has set herself up as the community dictator, just like Doro did with himself. I think in a lot of ways, Anyanwu is more competitive than she seems at face value in the books, and this is also reflected in her tendency to call things like abominations. She sees something that she doesn't completely agree with, a different culture is doing something, that's an abomination. I'd never. And that's her pride, her superiority, her thinking that her way is always better. And then after living with Doro for a while, she's taken that step of my way is always better to the next step of, so I am the leader and no complaints. So at the end of the story, when Anyanwu's community pretty much has been folded into Doro's breeding program, etc., but also Doro has promised to kind of improve the conditions and stop just abusing his own people, assuming that he follows that promise, which I don't think he will, but what if he did? Well, at that point, him and Anyanwu have come together to the middle ground. That at the beginning of the book, Doro was the ultimate toxic masculinity, everyone is expendable, I'm in charge of everyone, only my word matters. And Anyanwu was the ultimate, every life matters more than my own, I'm going to give my life to helping people, even if it's hard. But by the end of the book, they've both shifted a little bit into this middle ground of controlling these communities, of being these gods over these people, and yet not being more abusive than they have to in the process. Which isn't a very good middle ground, but I can see how they reached it, and it's pretty fascinating how they did find that equilibrium. I still wish that Anyanwu had really stood up to Doro, and that her changing him had been more of a proactive effort on her part, and not just an accident because it was his concession to her. But I also understand that this book is working within a very rigid framework, because it's a prequel to like 3 other books. So it has the relationship of Doro and Anyanwu in the future to work with. It can't just go off the rails and do its own thing. But this book, it's fascinating and beautiful, and I am so excited to read more books in this series. Anyway, if you made it to the end of the video, comment with an animal emoji, your favorite animal that Anyanwu turns into in this book. Dogs, dolphins, eagles, whatever. And thank you for watching.